Another weekend and another big night of boxing coming up. Of course, another undisputed fight. This one between Artur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol. Without sounding too sensationalist, this is probably the hardest fight I've ever tried to predict a winner for. I'm being genuine, I'm being honest. I've been dreading the thought of making this video for a very long time because on paper these two are so evenly matched, and in my head for so long it was 50-50 down the middle, and I was just like, I don't know how I'm going to go one way or the other. I was so tempted to sit on the fence and just be like, you know what, I'm not going to do a video, I'm just going to sit back and enjoy, and I'll review it after it's happened. But I can't do that, especially when my uploads have been so infrequent recently. So here we go. I feel like I've finally formulated a prediction. I feel like my thoughts are finally settled, and I'm going to present my breakdown and prediction to you guys now. So let's get into it. This fight, if we want to talk about it as a whole, from what I've seen, it seems to be billed as the strength and power of Beterbiev versus the speed and skill of Dmitry Bivol. And I can definitely see why that would be the case, why many people would see it like that. But I do think it's a bit of a reductionist view. Because yes, Beterbiev is freakishly strong and powerful, we know that. But he also does have a brilliant eye for punch placement and quite a good deal of precision to his offense. And that's upheld by a very solid base of schooling and technique. And then you have Dmitry Bivol, who has that trademark speed and mobility. And he marries that really well with the high volume, counter punching, combination punches. And he's got respectable power of his own, and also very accurate with that high volume of punching, and tremendously well conditioned because he can fight at a very high pace, maintain his speed, maintain his volume and his movement for 12 rounds without much of a problem. And so it's really needless to say that both of these guys bring a lot of attributes to the table. However, they also bring certain shortcomings too. Beterbiev in particular, he's at an advanced age in boxing years, and it's very clear to see that his body is somewhat struggling to stand up to the demands placed on it by the training and the fighting. And you can see that based on the fact that elephant in the room, this fight's already been postponed due to him sustaining a tear to his meniscus. And that, let me tell you, is a significant injury in isolation, but even more so when you consider the high amount of torque that Beterbiev relies on to generate the knockout power that he's known for. The amount of rotation, particularly through the lower body, but just the whole body as a unit. That's one of the mechanisms of many knee injuries, like meniscus injuries, like ACL injuries, is the rotation of the joints, particularly when a foot is planted. And so it does make you wonder, is that going to potentially impair his ability to use those power punches, which is really one of the cornerstones of his boxing approach. And additionally, we have Bivol, who's known for that mobility, and that could prove to be a real challenge for Artur Beterbiev if he's struggling to stay in front of Bivol and make those big punches count. So definitely some question marks there regarding Beterbiev's condition from a resilience, a robustness perspective, and how that's previous injury is going to impact his performance. But then if we look at it from a technical perspective, Beterbiev's defense is underdeveloped, I'd say. We've seen previously he will just rely often on relatively simple single layers of defense, such as backing up or just keeping his gloves up in a very static fashion. And previous opponents I'd say are much lesser than Dmitry Bivol, have been able to capitalize that on these defensive lapses, especially when they've followed up with combination punches. And that's something that Bivol does really well, is he'll counter you with combinations, head, body. He actually mixes in feints there to just add so many different layers of ambiguity. He'll have that in and out motion, and he'll change the angle. That's a lot of things you have to consider. And if you have a very basic single layer defense that Beterbiev often employs, it's just not good enough in many instances. And so in my head, that's a clear route for success for Dmitry Bivol. However, Bivol himself is not invincible. despite being renowned for his mobility, he is actually no stranger to being pinned on the ropes when his opponents actually attempt to press forward. Canelo Alvarez showed this. Alvarez showed that if you have some subtle head movements, some feints, and some steady pressure, you can actually push Bivol back and close the distance, and he relies on that distance to maintain that flow of straight punches. You can see this in boxing, but I can also talk from experience. In the kind of Eastern Bloc boxing school, there is a reliance on straight punches. There's very little investment in many of these schools, a very small investment in fighting up close, your shorter punches, your hooks and uppercuts, like the really compact offense. I don't know the rationale behind it, but I guess it comes back to the kind of old amateur days where point scoring, quote unquote, was the kind of the main objective. But yeah, Bivol is one of those fighters. He comes from that Soviet school of boxing, and there isn't much of an investment in his fighting up close, and so he certainly relies on that space, and he does manage it very well. However, as I've said, you can push him back, and if you do get him back up to the ropes, he goes into a very defensive posture. And even though Beterbiev lacks some of that nuance that Alvarez may have, I think he more than makes up for it with his offensive prowess and brute force. And yeah, Bivol can tuck up when he's pinned down and he might move off. But time and time again, Beterbiev, I feel, has shown that power. He has that type of power that causes you damage even if you attempt to block it. Even if you attempt to roll with it, it's still going to cost you something. It's just bludgeoning power. And so I think that puts Dmitry Bivol potentially in a very difficult spot. And needless to say, you should probably avoid being pinned down by Beterbiev, because the amount of damage this guy can do in, a few short seconds, a few moments, is really quite extraordinary. When in the middle of the ring, Bivol does a great job of overwhelming his opponent with volume, and defensively, he has some little subtleties, some nuance of his own, especially the way he manages distance. That's kind of his primary defensive layer, is that in and out movement, which he can actually counter off of as well. But he also uses head control to neutralize returning offense. And over the years, I think Bivol has shown respectable power, but it certainly isn't a major strength of his. And I do actually think that this can be critical in a fight like this, because yes, Beterbiev has been down before. He's been hurt as well, most notably by Callum Johnson and Anthony Yard, respectively. But to my eye, both of those guys possess a degree of power and explosiveness in particular that Bivol just doesn't have, in my opinion. Bivol's quick, but he's not really forceful. He's more of a high velocity, whereas Callum Johnson, Anthony Yard, they have like an explosiveness that has force behind it. It's a good marriage of speed and power, and not just speed, if that makes sense. There's more weight behind their punches because they don't rely on the same kind of volume that Bivol does. And I think that suddenness that they have, and just the harder punches, that's what caught Beterbiev out. And nevertheless, Beterbiev still got to his feet. He still recovered in both those instances and came back to win in big, brutal fashion. So I don't know how much we can look into it, but I just think that is potentially a little bit precarious for Dmitry Bivol. And because of that, I personally struggle to see how Bivol gets Beterbiev under manners. I think there are going to be moments with that high volume, with that combination punching, with that movement, where he's able to disrupt Beterbiev, but I don't think he's going to really be able to stick it on Beterbiev and make him think, damn, I can't just press this guy. I'm going to have to slow the pace down. I'm going to have to think my way in. I don't know if Bivol can do that. And because of that, I think Beterbiev will remain relatively comfortable outside of those moments of disruption, maybe a bit of frustration. I think he'll be able to get into range, and I think he'll be able to land his punches. I suspect that Bivol is tough enough to last longer than any previous opponent, and that just comes from the fact that I haven't really seen Bivol ever look that vulnerable. I know there was that moment in the Joe Smith fight where I think he got hit on the bell and he wobbled a little bit, but I want to say that's largely a bit of an anomaly because it was on the bell. Like, it was a bit of a delayed punch, and it wasn't like he got flattened or anything. His legs just buckled. And in reality, most fighters, you'd probably be able to catch them out if you punched them just as they let their guard down. And maybe it was a little bit of negligence by Bivol, but nevertheless, other than that, he hasn't really put a foot wrong. He hasn't really looked that vulnerable, but he hasn't also taken many heavy punches. So I guess this is going to be a little bit of an acid test for his resilience. But I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, and I think he will be tougher than many of Beterbiev's previous opponents. And for that reason, I think the fight will go long, given that toughness I suspect Bivol has, but also Bivol's movement. I think that will, throughout most of the fight, help to reset the engagement. So he's not just, it's not just, back-to-back action. It's got space in between engagements where both guys are moving around the ring, resetting, posturing, looking to make the other guy go first, and then they go into trading offense or whatever. Ultimately, though, I think in those instances, even if they trade punches and land the same number of punches, I just think Artur Beterbiev are going to be a bit more meaningful and a bit more damaging. And especially if he invests in the body, I think he's going to do a good job of slowing Bivol down. And if he's able to do so successfully, that's how I think he secures a stoppage. So I guess it is contingent on how often Beterbiev lands and where he lands especially. But as I say, I just think he will be able to get through. I think it's too there's too much time to kill, and I think Beterbiev does land, and when he does, the effect will be noticeable. And so I rate Bivol highly, I really do, and I can see how he wins this one. But my gut, after months of back and forth, is telling me that this is probably Beterbiev's time. Even as a 40-year-old man, I think he gets this one. I think he becomes undisputed light heavyweight champion, and I think he stops Bivol. I don't think it will be the most brutal, sudden stoppage. I think it will be a slow kind of breaking down process where Bivol, he's probably just slowed down too much, shipped a bit too much punishment, and he probably just gets counted out. That's how I see it going. Round 11, something like that, quite late into the fight. However, that is just my opinion. And yeah, you leave yours in the comment section below. What do you think of my breakdown? Do you agree with my points? Do you disagree? Do you think there's anything I've missed? Leave it down there and I'll get back to you. But for now, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you on the next one.